Welcome to the Psychology in School team's podcast on how to manage anxiety on the return to school. I'm Dr. Beth Mosley, and today with me I have two of my colleagues from the team. So there's Tamara. Hello, Tamara.
Hello, hi.
And there's Hope.
Hello.
And we're all clinical psychologists. So I think it's really important to acknowledge at the beginning of this podcast that for many young people, the idea of returning to school in September is going to feel challenging and potentially anxiety provoking, and maybe a little bit exciting as well. So young people, there's going to be a real mixture of emotions, and that's very, very normal. Many young people will not have been at school for almost 6 months. So it's a really quite a big and significant event that's going to be happening in their life. And as parents, I think we can probably acknowledge that we'll be feeling anxious about it too, because it's going to feel different from perhaps before lockdown and before when children were at school normally. And as adults, we're probably facing similar anxieties if we're returning to the workplace. We'll also be thinking about how that's different and facing those fears. So as a parent, I'm just thinking about what might be the signs and symptoms that a young person is feeling anxious.
Yeah, so I think it can look different for different young people, but something that can be really helpful to look out for is just a general change in behaviour or change in your young person's presentation. So, for example, it may be that they're less interested in things that they valued. It may be that they seem a bit less engaged with family life, shutting themselves away a bit, just more quiet than their usual self. So just to kind of notice those changes in behaviour and presentation, and it could be anxiety or it could be something else. But it's a good opportunity to kind of check in with your young person at that point and ask what may be going on for them. I think it's also really common to experience lots of physical or physiological changes when we experience anxiety as well. So just to name a few, it may be that people get nauseous or start to experience stomach aches. So we've all heard the term of butterflies in our stomach. So that's quite a physical response to anxiety. It may be that people get hot or sweaty. It can impact on muscles, so you may get lots of tension or aches. And with acute anxiety, it can even lead to things like changes in our breathing. It may be a bit more rapid, a bit more shallow. Our heartbeat may change and be a bit faster. So actually similar to when you've done exercise, or actually some of those symptoms are similar to being really excited as well. So it can be helpful just to know that those are just signs of anxiety. And actually, I think often they can be confused with physical illness. So it may be that rather than your young person saying, I'm feeling really anxious this morning about school, they come to you and say, I've got a really bad stomach ache, or I feel a bit sick, I'm not very well. So it can be useful to explore those and try and understand if there's possibly any anxiety there. And just a brief note on that, those physical signs, sometimes they can feel a bit scary and, as I said, maybe associated with illness, but they are quite normal in anxiety. And it just results from the fact that when our brain perceives a threat, it goes into what's called fight or flight mode. So the body's just gearing up for us to run away from a threat or fight for our lives. And that's really helpful when we're faced with physical threats. Not so helpful with more the psychological non-physical threats, but that's why they come up, and they're not dangerous and quite normal. So it can be really useful to share some of that with your young person. We've developed a podcast on sleep before, but often when someone's worried, that can impact on their sleep. So if you're finding that your young person is saying that they're finding it really difficult to get to sleep, or they're waking up a lot in the night, or even having some nightmares, again, that could be an indication that something like anxiety is going on for them. And it may be that actually your young person can just verbalise to you that they're feeling anxious. Some may be able to do that. And often if there's worries, there may be lots of kind of what if questions. So what if something goes wrong? There may be lots of reassurance seeking from you. So trying to get reassurance that everything's going to be okay. That's quite a clear indicator that they're feeling anxious. So they may be asking lots of questions about the return to school, and they're kind of wanting to get some certainty to alleviate that anxiety. And I think also linked to that, they may actually go the other way and not want to talk about school at all. So it's really common to want to avoid the things that make us anxious. So there may be some young people who don't want to talk about the start of school, don't want to start preparation, or won't want to, I don't know, go clothes shopping for school when it gets sooner to the date. They may even be avoiding going past the school. So again, if they're clearly avoiding some of those aspects, that can be another good indicator that potentially they're quite anxious about it.
Oh, okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And so I guess we're probably all wondering what young people might be worried about in terms of going back to school. And there has been quite a lot of research in this area, some of it quite local in Suffolk. And I think the key themes that are coming out of that research is that young people are worried about COVID, not so much for themselves getting COVID, but worrying about passing it on to family members. They also tend to be focused on thinking about how they're going to reconnect with their friends. If class is going to be different, will they be able to still be with their friends? And I think for every school, they're setting up ways of being in the school which will feel different for young people, especially in some of the larger secondary schools who are creating zones, or young people are having to stay in bubbles. So I imagine lots of young people have got questions about how school's going to feel different for them, and if that's going to make it difficult for them to connect up with, for example, friends they might have in a different year group. So I think young people will be keen to know, how is it going to be different? What will that feel and look like? And I think one of the themes that's coming through is that for a lot of young people, not having had the academic pressure that they have had through this time in the same way, it's definitely felt like a relief for many young people. And so I guess the thought that going back to that highly pressured environment where they've not only got to kind of get back in with the new structure, but they've also got to connect up with their friends. They've also kind of got to re-engage with that learning. So I think some young people are concerned about those pressures and feeling like they may have fallen behind their peer group, and how will they catch up? And I guess that just sense of getting used to a different routine. And I imagine for some young people who were struggling with school before, who may have experienced bullying or found that it difficult to get their learning needs met at school, those young people may be more anxious because their experience of school before lockdown was actually quite difficult. So the thought of going back to school is going to be harder because they won't have those more positive experiences to draw on. So for example, my daughter's in year 6 and she did go back to school at the end of the term. And I know for her, one of the things that helped her get back to school was knowing one friend of hers was in one of the bubbles she was going to be in. And that was the driving force for her to kind of manage that horrible feeling. It was the one thing I could say, you're going to really enjoy seeing this friend. And that was a comfort for her as well. So I think for some young people, if they haven't got that sense of a good friend or a good teacher, then it may be even more difficult for them to think about going back to school. So thinking about my daughter, who was worried about all of these things when she went back in June, because she was in year 6, one of the things that I found, because we only really had a week's notice about that, is that she was so preoccupied with the idea that she was not going to be going back to school, and there was nothing I could do to make her go back to school. And I wondered if that's going to be a common theme for lots of young people over this summer period, and what that might be about.
And I guess as parents, the one thing that's really helpful to kind of hold in mind is that anxiety, it is a physiological response from the brain who thinks that there is danger. And, sometimes that's going to be driven by a fear that I guess something bad might happen while they're at school. Other times I think it's probably not driven by anything in particular. But I guess it's just kind of holding on to this idea that, when anxiety takes hold for our young people or for ourselves, it can feel really overwhelming. And I think life really becomes about avoiding the anxiety rather than thinking about kind of how do you embrace life, I guess. And I think, as parents, I think we need to hold on to kind of the two really big parts that kind of maintain anxiety. So avoidance is probably the thing that we need to be most mindful of. And this can feel a little bit counterintuitive, because when we have our child in front of us and they're really struggling with something like going back to school, I guess our default might be, okay, I really don't like seeing my child like this. Let's just keep them at home for one day. And what will happen if you do that is you will see a drastic decrease in their anxiety. But the difficulty with this strategy is that it's only very temporary, because actually the next day the school comes around again and their anxiety will probably just be a tiny bit higher. So I guess out of all the things that we can do to help our children, not colluding with avoidance is probably one of the biggest ones. The other thing I think we all do a lot with our kids when they're feeling anxious is we provide them with a lot of reassurance. And again, a little bit similar to avoidance, we provide them with reassurance, and it gives them kind of a temporary relief from their anxiety. But actually what we're doing by providing that reassurance is we're taking away their opportunity to develop those self-soothing skills themselves. So something that can be much more helpful is this idea of asking them questions rather than giving them the answers. So just facilitating them to start questioning the worries that they're having. So I guess an example of that might be, your child comes to you and they say, I'm really worried that my friend Emily isn't going to talk to me anymore because I haven't seen her for 3 months. And I guess instead of saying, oh, of course Emily will talk to you, you guys have been friends for a really long time, it might be instead to say something like, well, what happens after the summer, a normal summer, when you haven't seen Emily for 6 weeks? What is it like when you go back to school on those occasions? And I guess by just taking that approach, it just gives the child an opportunity to think, oh yeah, okay, so when I haven't seen her for 6 weeks before, actually it's been a tiny bit awkward when I meet her initially, but then it's okay. And it's just, I suppose it's just that mind shift of, instead of giving that reassurance, you're helping them to reassure themselves. So those are two of the big things that I think are really helpful.
And I'm just thinking about that week, actually, when my daughter was adamant she wasn't going back to school. I mean, the challenges as a parent is sometimes you get stuck in this cycle with your child where, for example, Eva just kept saying all of the time, randomly, I'm not going to school, Mum, you can't make me, you can't force me. And literally would just be doing something normal, and this would just pop up out of the blue. And for me, it was just becoming really agitating, because I was like, and I ended up kind of either walking away or saying to her, you are going to school, you have no choice. And I think, I'm trying to reflect on, is there something I could have done better or differently that week? Because my own fear of what if she is going to actually not to go to school, what will I do about this on Monday morning, was making me feel quite wound up and irritated by her constantly going on about this all week.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that also feels really, really familiar for me. And I think sometimes anxiety can be incredibly hard to understand. But I think telling our young people that they have nothing to worry about generally will only make it harder for them. And I know it's really hard as a parent and it can feel super frustrating. But I guess if you're able to try and get alongside them and be with them where they are. So instead of saying, I guess what we all feel like saying sometimes, like, oh, don't be silly, you don't need to worry about that, it will be okay. It's taking a much more validating response, and it's saying something like, I really wish that going to school was easier for you. I can see how much this is upsetting you. And I get it. It's really hard to go back to somewhere after you've had such a big break. But actually, this is just something we need to do. But I get that it's really hard, because by taking that response, even though it can feel quite tricky, I guess what the child is experiencing is, my mom or my dad or whoever's looking after me, they get it. They can see that this is really hard for me. So, Dan Siegel, who writes a lot about kind of helping children manage various things, he talks about this idea of naming it to tame it. And sometimes I think it is just taking that time to say, I wonder if you are feeling really worried because you haven't seen your friends for a long time, or because you have missed out on loads of work and that's making you feel really worried. And sometimes you'll get that right and sometimes you'll get it wrong, but it's a really nice way for our children to be seen. And it's not, a lot of parents worry, I think, with this approach, that they're just going to escalate the difficulties, or they're going to kind of buy into what the child is already experiencing. And and I get that can be kind of a concern, but I suppose actually what you're doing by getting alongside your child is you're helping to bring down their hyper aroused level, which means that they will move into a position where they'll be able to start thinking a lot more rationally about it. And then it will be much easier to begin to have those conversations, Beth, like you had with your daughter. So thinking about, okay, well, who are the other children that are going to be in your bubble? And helping them to kind of recognize the positives about going back into school. But it is literally going to be nearly impossible to do that conversation and think about those positives with your child until you've moved them out of that position of a high level of anxiety into a place where they feel kind of more calm and relaxed. So I think probably that's one of the best ways that we can respond, but I recognize it can be really difficult.
And just adding into that, Tamara, I think it can be really helpful also to find opportunities to talk about the anxiety or what may be going on for someone before it gets to that state of hyper-arousal. So it may be kind of regularly being able to check in with them, how they're doing, or weeks before school, starting to ask about their feelings about school before it gets to the day, because as you said, that conversation can be a lot more difficult once someone's already aroused. Yeah. And I know that a lot of parents say that it can be really challenging to have quite direct conversations with their young people about how they're feeling. It's not always that easy to talk about. So it may just be using creative ways to do that. Actually, a lot of parents say that they have some of the best conversations with their children when they're in the car with them, perhaps because it's not direct and there's less pressure. So yeah, doing things like that, or or drawing or doing an activity, walking alongside them and talking, and just making that quite a routine question and check-in time almost each day can be really helpful to start expressing some of those things before they feel like they get a bit too much and that hyperarousal state comes in.
And I think that idea, Hope, of being quite proactive, like I know for my daughter, just before she goes to sleep, that's the time when she's going to start wanting to talk to me about her worries, and then we'll end up in this really prolonged period of me in her bedroom, and then she is finding it quite difficult to go to sleep. And one of the little things I've learned to do is to watch, like say to her earlier in the evening, let's watch Friends together or something she likes on TV. And it's often whilst we're watching that together that we can then start to have these conversations way before bedtime. And I think because we're both calm and we're just watching something which is easy and fun to watch, it just makes that whole experience feel so much more positive and helpful, not just for her, but for me as well, because I get incredibly frustrated when I think I'm just about to get my evening when I have this extra demand on me, when I'm feeling quite tired and it's been a long day. So kind of like recognizing it's my child's resource level and it's my resource level, and trying to find points in the day where both of our resource levels are higher so that we can have these more challenging conversations, I guess, in a place that feels safe and containing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly helpful, and I think there's also something about kind of the messages that we're giving our children. When our children or us, when we start to experience anxiety, it generally means that we are about to do something that's brave. Whether that's kind of going back to school after a really long break, or we're doing something for the very first time. We all get those feelings of anxiety, and I think it's just about the language, I guess, that we're using with our children, so that we are, if we are linking up with anxiety with bravery and courage, and we're giving them that clear message of, I know you've got this. You have those feelings in your tummy, but you know what? That doesn't mean that you can't do it. And I think as parents, we need to be a bit mindful of that, because I think there can be an inclination to kind of get really anxious ourselves and kind of think, oh gosh, I don't really know if they're able to cope. And almost unwittingly, we can start to give our children those messages through our own level of anxiety. So I guess it's just really thinking about, what messages or what vibes are you kind of giving out about your belief in how your child can manage this stuff.
I was wondering about some of the things that we could do really practically with our children, because I know, Hope, you've mentioned about fight or flight and our increased heart rate, and also kind of what happens when we get these worrying thoughts. Are there things that we can give our children as ways of managing those really difficult physical feelings and those kind of thoughts that might be rushing through their head?
Yeah, so I think there are some things, and again, you can think about this proactively and help your children build up these skills for managing the anxiety when it comes. So as you said, we've mentioned some of the physical experiences that we may get when we feel anxious, and there are some kind of quite quick things that can be done just to make those feelings feel a bit manageable. It doesn't mean that they're going to completely go away, but it makes them a bit more tolerable. So something that a lot of people use is just a quick breathing technique. So I mentioned that sometimes our breathing can change and become a bit more rapid when we feel anxious. And there's lots of different breathing techniques, and I think it's just finding one that's quite memorable and easy to do. So for example, it may just be breathing in for a count of 4 and then breathing out for a count of 4, just to slow the breathing down a little bit. It could be concentrating on something in the present environment. So if your young person's getting quite caught up with all of their worries and focusing on their anxiety and the physical feelings, it may be helping them connect to where they are, what they can see in the room, what they can hear, what they can kind of feel or sense, just to kind of ground them into the present moment a bit. So those kind of things can just help lower that arousal level just a little bit, so that maybe they're freed up a bit more to talk it through. It can also be quite helpful, again, but before the anxiety comes, to come up with some positive coping statements that the young person can remind themselves of when they're feeling quite anxious. And to do that, it can be helpful to maybe think back to a past experience where they've felt anxious before, or they've done something challenging that they didn't think they'd be able to do. Get them to go through that memory, what helped in that situation, but also what did they learn about themselves. And they may say things like, oh, you know, I am really brave, or I can do difficult things. So just to kind of come up with some of those statements, maybe write them down to give them a bit of confidence in managing some of those difficult stuff when they come up.
Oh, that's really helpful. And I guess there are some quite nice apps that you can use with young people to practice breathing, where breathing bubbles which come in and out, so that young people, because it's actually really hard to breathe in this way where you're kind of basically having a longer out breath. It's a really hard thing to learn to do, even if you're an adult. So I think younger children can find it especially difficult. And so to have something visual to help them get into that habit and routine. And again, I guess it's even harder if you're already breathing quickly. So I know for a lot of the young people I've worked with in the past, I've said, try and practice this breathing when you're actually feeling quite calm, because then your body gets used to it and your brain gets used to it. And then when you're feeling anxious and your breathing is really taking over and getting quicker, it will be easier to do that calm breathing. And so I guess that's where bedtime is quite a nice time to be able to practice that with your young person. And depending on their age, there's lots of self-directed apps that you can use to help with that. And that's just making me think about a few things to do with young people's kind of motivation, really. We're talking about being brave and having courage, which 100%, you know, when we get that anxious feeling, that's what we're doing. And I guess for some young people, and even myself, if I'm doing something brave and it's something that's really important to me and it's something I really value and I really want to get this thing done so I can enjoy the rest of my day or go home that night from work and have a nice meal because I've managed to do this achievement today, I guess it's my internal motivation to overcome that horrible feeling of anxiety, which is driving me over that hump of the anxious feeling. And I guess the belief that the feeling will go, that it won't stay forever. And I think that's the really scary feeling about anxiety, is that you have this feeling that it will either get so bad that you're going to maybe even pass out, or the feeling will never go away unless I don't do this thing I'm worried about doing. And one of the key things I guess we know about anxiety is that it doesn't stay forever, and it doesn't ever cause you to kind of pass out or anything like that. Actually, if we can tolerate that feeling for long enough and get over the other side of it, then it starts to fade away. And I'm thinking about my daughter going back to school. For me, it was quite easy to help her think about what she values about being in school and to help her with that feeling. So you will get to see your friends today. You'll get to see your tutor who you really like. You'll get to do some learning with someone, not me, because I think that didn't go so well. So there were lots of things inside of my daughter that made it more easy for her to overcome that feeling and think, yes, it's worth it. But then I'm just thinking about an example with my son, who's younger, who's 7, and who really didn't have anything inside of him that made him want to go into school as a key worker child. And so it was almost impossible to engage in that kind of collaborative conversation about what about this and what about that, because for him it was just a blank outright. There is nothing that you can say that's going to make me feel better about going to school, or I want to do with going to school. I just want to stay at home. And so in that scenario, I needed to kind of think about, how do I cope with doing something I really, really don't want to do as an adult? What do I do to get through those experiences? And actually, I thought about work. Sometimes I don't actually really want to do my work on a bad day, or there's something really challenging. And one of the things that motivates me is knowing I'm earning a salary and that I can buy something at the end of the month if I've had a difficult month that I've been really looking forward to buying. So I think it's worth holding in mind that often as adults we need external motivators to help us do the things that we find difficult or we feel anxious about. And so it's only fair for young people too that they will really benefit from knowing there's something they're really struggling with, especially when they're doing these things for the first time. Having that external motivation or that reward will be really helpful for that young person to help them tolerate that difficult feeling. So in the end, for my son, we did have that conversation, and I was able to kind of be honest about the days I struggle and what are the things that help me. And he came up with a really good solution. He was saving up for something that was really important to him, and we agreed that if he was able to manage to get into school that day, I would give him a certain amount of money to help him save up for this thing. And actually it really worked, because we went from me thinking, oh no, the next stage is me not dragging him, but forcing him into the car and him getting to school and crying as he's leaving me. But with him feeling like he had this thing that was important to him in that moment in time as the reward for what he would get through tolerating this difficult feeling, that was enough for him to actually just get his school uniform on and get in the car and go into school that day with a sense of, I'm doing this not because I want to go to school, but because I'm actually going to get something that I value at the moment. And actually within 2 days, I was very concrete with him. I gave him the physical money. I showed it to him before he went in. And actually that was just what he needed. And then for him, after those 2 days, he never mentioned it again. It wasn't a problem. And I guess sometimes as parents, we do have to be quite creative about finding what is going to enable our children to tolerate that difficult feeling, just as we do as ourselves as adults, if that makes sense.
And I think, Beth, that really illustrates really beautifully actually the importance of supporting our children to go through the experience. And I guess what it feels like you're kind of talking about is kind of being flexible in our parenting, excuse me, and just recognizing that for some children you will need to think a little bit outside the box, and you will need to think about those more external motivators. But actually the massive benefit of your son going through that experience gives him the knowledge of, actually this is okay. I went and I survived and nothing bad happened. And that's a really powerful way to kind of fight back against anxiety. So I think that's a lovely example.
And I think because he then had this motivating thing, which was outside of himself, it kind of changed his perspective on the day, because instead of going into school really distressed, looking for all the things that are going to make him feel unsafe or that he's not enjoying, I could kind of see he just went into school with a bit more of a, well, I'm going to get the best out of this today. And I guess one of the challenges that we face sometimes is when our children come away from a difficult school day is that they want to sometimes focus on talking about all the things that went wrong. And we kind of know that's how anxiety works. You know, we're looking out for all the things that aren't going well, because that we have a sense that will protect us from being in a dangerous situation. So that's our brain's natural way of looking for problems. And I guess we all do that as adults too. If we have a difficult day at work, we tend to just be left with the thing that went wrong rather than all the 10 things that went right. And sometimes I have to do that self-talk to myself as an adult and think, okay, there is something I messed up on at work today, but then there are all these other things that I didn't. And it's kind of holding that kind of perspective and being kind to yourself is so important and valuable. And I guess if we can role model that to our children, then we're giving them skills for life. So in some respects, the way that we support our children through this experience is an opportunity for them to learn how to manage those difficult feelings about doing things that are difficult, because it is going to be difficult for lots of young people in these early stages. And thinking about, especially with our adolescents, if I listen to this anxious feeling and I don't go back to school in September, what will my life look like at Christmas or January? Will my anxiety have faded? Will have things got better? Compared to if I manage to overcome this feeling and get back into school and learn that it will get easier, this feeling won't last forever, how will things be at Christmas or in January? And I think that's really useful with teenagers particularly, because they can think more about the future, because quite often with anxiety you get so stuck in the here and now that you forget about, well, if I follow what anxiety is telling me, then actually what happens in the future if I just continue to avoid this forever. And I guess that brings us to thinking about how as an adult do I respond or manage my young person's anxiety if I myself are feeling really anxious about them going back to school, or just generally finding this whole time incredibly difficult. So how do we manage that dynamic really as parents?
Yeah, I think that's really important to mention, because of course parents are going to have their own anxieties, and it may be about the return to school specifically, it may be about their own work or home life, and also parents can find it really distressing seeing their child in distress. So I think the first thing to say is just for parents to be kind to themselves, and although parents are superheroes in many ways, that doesn't mean they're immune to experiencing all of their own difficulties. So I think just acknowledging that it's okay, that things won't feel okay with parents all the time, and taking a bit more of a compassionate attitude towards yourself as you would do to your young person. And that may involve looking after yourself, so what's known as self-care, doing some activities or things that you value, taking some time out or to step back. And as you said, when we're feeling very emotional, it can be really difficult to help someone else feeling really emotional as well. So I think taking that time to step out, maybe talk to other parents or other adults about our own emotions, not having to kind of fix it straight away, and then once you've sorted that out a bit for yourself, then you may have a bit of space to talk it through and process with your young person.
I guess the other thing that was just coming into my mind is thinking about children who are kind of living across two different households. And often parents have kind of very different ways, I suppose, of managing children who are feeling anxious. And it can be quite difficult for children if they're kind of getting quite mixed messages. So one parent is kind of saying, oh, I get that school is really, really difficult for you, but let's make a plan and let's think about how you're going to get there anyway. But then another parent, because maybe they're struggling a little bit more with the anxiety, they're kind of giving the message, oh yeah, it's a little bit too hard for you to go to school, let's just kind of have today off. I think that makes it even more tricky for children. So I think it's helpful, if it's at all possible, for parents to have just a really consistent approach, so that the child is kind of getting the same message from both parents. Just as an add-on, really, just to hold in mind, because I know I've certainly worked with children in the past where different messages have been coming kind of from different households, and I just think it makes the whole process of doing hard things much harder.
One other thing to note is that we have talked a little bit about school anxiety, but sometimes that anxiety can lead to prolonged school refusal, and just real difficulties getting your young person to school on an ongoing basis. And that will be for only a very minority of young people. But if this is something that you would be interested to find out more about or get support on, then there are some helpful resources and local services that can support. So one really useful and local website that you could go on is Suffolk SENDIAS. So that's www.suffolk and then it's sendiass.co.uk. And there are links on there around education, SEND support and school anxiety, and it's just got a bit of information about when that happens, how to kind of work with school and also other services that you could possibly access.
Is there anything that you think that we haven't covered yet that we think would be good to cover?
I guess the last thing I was thinking about as you were just talking then, Beth, is just about including school in some of this. So we talked about there may be another parent or adult that you can work alongside, but also around school, because if your young person is worried about school, there may be some things that school staff can help to do it, and it may just be letting school staff know that your child is particularly anxious so they can be a bit more aware of that. They may be, for example, able to make sure that someone that your child really gets on with is able to greet them on their first day, or just check in with them, do an activity with them at break times. So it may be helpful just to talk to your school and again come up with a consistent plan together and work as a team to help your young person.
And I think it's just important to add that, anxiety doesn't happen overnight, and change to anxiety probably isn't going to happen overnight. For most children, they take like lots of steps forward, but then they might take some steps backwards. And I guess just by continuing with helping them to kind of face those hard things, eventually those steps forward will get much bigger than the steps backwards. And I guess just holding on to the influence that you can have with your child who has anxiety, and you're in a really powerful position to kind of influence this, but it probably will take a little bit of time.
And really, as a final note, I think one of the things that anxiety can do is it can take away fun, and it's trying to find ways to keep things playful and fun with young people, because really that's a big part of what childhood is about. And I know for lots of adults, the way we cope with feeling quite stressed, and lots of adults through COVID would have coped with humour. And I guess what young people really need the opportunities to have fun with us as parents, with their peer group, and hopefully at school as well when they go back to school. So I guess keeping it fun and playful, and laughter, how important it is for young people to have that opportunity to laugh. And I think with some young people I've worked with in the past who've been anxious, that's one of the things parents have found really hard, is seeing that part of their young person potentially shut down a little bit. And as parents, when we become anxious about our young people, that bit of us shuts down a bit as well, because the anxiety completely takes over. So I guess that's just the last bit I was really thinking about, is make sure that we can kind of find a way to keeping things as fun as possible for young people, because I know it's been a really, really serious time, but having fun is not going to create any harm. It's going to be really, really good for us all. So thank you for listening today, and we look forward to joining you again for a podcast in the future.
Lovely, thank you.